most famous trials were those held in
Nuremberg is the 14th largest city in Germany. It has a reconstructed 1,000-year-old castle, some lovely-looking canals, a number of fine dining options. But recently, when I've looked at a person presiding over an act of unimaginable cruelty and thought, they need to be Nuremberged, I'm not referring to a Bavarian vacation. This is not a thought I'm particularly happy about having. It's not a historically informed thought, really, almost more of a tick, an impulse. I see something, some decision made, some photo op performed that seems motivated by such vicious inhumanity that my brain, reeling, searches back to find some instance, any instance of political justice, of punishment, of consequence, of someone not getting away with it. And in that semi-staggered state, I latched onto Nuremberg, specifically the Nuremberg trials after World War II. It's a historical event I knew very little about. I only really knew the outcome. A bunch of Nazis are put on trial for their crimes against humanity. A bunch of Nazis are found guilty. A bunch of Nazis get hanged. In a way, the haziness of my understanding helped make this an appealing target to point to. Without getting bogged down in facts and details, Nuremberg could just exist as an idea to me, an actual representation of that elusive feeling of justice. I can even brush aside its obvious contradictions with my own ideology, including the fact that I am, notably, opposed to capital punishment. By leaving it so uninvestigated, Nuremberg remained a fantasy, a vague notion that one day history's villains will be held to task for the monsters they create. But historical fantasies are no place to take refuge in. Some loose sense of prior justice serves no purpose without a deeper understanding. And so, over the past several months, I have read and read and read about the Nuremberg trials. I've read contemporaneous reporting and modern retrospectives. Over this period, I've been a really fun guy to spend time with and had really normal conversations. And on the other side of my research, the Nuremberg trials no longer exist as a fantasy to me. They are an immensely complicated historical phenomena, quite impressive in some ways, and yet deeply flawed in many others. At the conclusion of his tome, Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial, Joseph Persico adapts a quote by scientist Thomas Huxley. The example of Nuremberg, Persico writes, was a beautiful idea murdered by a gang of ugly facts. It's a striking note to leave us on. Which parts of the idea were beautiful? Do those facts puncture its concept or, forgive me, its execution? And in 2025, what does it mean to yearn for Nuremberg? Nuremberg's history within World War II started far before the trials. Beginning in 1923, the city was home to the Nuremberg rallies, massive campaign and propaganda events for the Nazi Party. It was in Nuremberg that Leni Riefenstahl filmed Triumph of the Will, one of the most famous propaganda films of all time. It was during one of these rallies that the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews, and shortly after blacks and Romani, of their rights and declared each group enemies of the race-based state. The Nazis chose Nuremberg to begin with as part of their historical myth-making effort. The city had previously been a crucial part of the Holy Roman Empire, a gathering place for the Reichstag, and even pre-World War II carried out several pogroms against its Jewish population. On the back of this history, the Nazis promised to build Germany's greatest empire. Instead, the city was blown to bits. During the war, the Allies dropped thousands upon thousands of bombs on Nuremberg. In a survey afterwards, the US described the city as 91% destroyed. It literally stank from thousands of bodies trapped beneath the rubble. But, in a feat of great historical irony, one of the few buildings still standing was Nuremberg's massive courthouse and its attached jail. A courthouse, a site of supposed justice among the ruins. The city had provided the infrastructure for the next chapter of its history. That's not to say everyone agreed that the Nazis should be given a formal trial. FDR and Churchill had both, at different points in time, leaned towards immediate, summary executions of Nazi leaders. Henry Morgenthau, the U.S.'s Treasury Secretary, suggested, in addition to shooting leaders on sight, that they exile Nazi Party members a la Napoleon while using POWs to completely strip Germany of its industry and return it to an agrarian society. And if nothing else, why not at least try the Nazis outside of Germany? Luxembourg, for example, could host the trials, a neutral territory not shattered by aerial bombing nor clouded by the stench of death. But eventually, the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union agreed. The answer would be trials, they would be legitimate, and they would be in Germany. The chief American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, felt that German criminality must be tried in its home country. He said that it was massively significant that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law. Many also hoped that the trials would reveal the scale of the Nazi horrors to both the German people and the world. Telford Taylor, an American prosecutor, envisioned the trials as classrooms which would quash any German political or cultural tendencies to whitewash the Third Reich. This idea of a classroom, while not as broadly retributive as returning Germany to an agrarian society, still raises one of the most important questions of the trials. That is, were they just for show? A classroom seems to represent a predetermined outcome, not an even balance of power. Also not representative of an even balance of power, the victor of a war occupying the loser's country. This was one of the biggest criticisms of the trials, both while they happened and in the decades since. How could they possibly be fair? Would this just be a show trial, essentially a punishment levied against the Germans for losing the war? But in all my research, what's continually surprised me is the overwhelming fairness, borderline leniency, that the Nazi defendants were treated with. In the first and most famous of the Nuremberg trials, 24 men were charged by the newly formed International Military Tribunal, or IMT. Each defendant was allowed to choose his own lawyer. The IMT, in fact, paid for these lawyers, who were often themselves Nazis. The lawyers were given complete access to the prosecutor's documents, much as they would be in a typical domestic trial, as well as secretaries, stenographers, translation services, and virtually unlimited time with their clients. One aide remarked that they wished the average defendant in an American court had access to the type of assistance given to the Nazis. In court, the Nazis were allowed to enter virtually any material as defense, including thousands of pages of philosophy that had to be translated for everyone in the court. Prosecutors were prevented from cutting off the defendants' responses, turning what should have been hard-hitting interrogations into opportunities for the Nazis to wax rhapsodic about their lives and virtues. Each defendant was allowed hours, even days, to regale the court with their own life stories. And at the end of the trial, multiple men were fully acquitted. The larger issue with the trials, from a legal standpoint, wasn't how the defendants were treated, it was the trial's very premise. No matter the defense resources given to the Nazis on trial, the fact remained that the categories of crimes the defendants were charged with, including crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, were created for the Nuremberg trials. Some argued it was unfair to retroactively charge the Nazis with newly created laws. There are a couple counters to this claim, though. Germany had previously signed several international pacts outlawing war, treaties from The Hague and Geneva about the rules of warfare, and peace agreements with Poland and the Soviet Union. This was where the charge of crimes against peace came from, as well as the definitions of the many war crimes committed by the German army. Crimes against humanity was not drawn from previously agreed upon treaties, however. It is a category at once more legally tenuous and more morally obvious. The IMT defined crimes against humanity as the, and I quote, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds qualified as crimes against humanity, quote, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country where perpetrated. The IMT stated that even if technically legal within a country, these horrors could not be allowed. In a refreshing break from legalese, Prosecutor Jackson said, let's not be derailed by legal hair splitters. Aren't murder, torture, and enslavement crimes recognized by all civilized people? What we propose is to punish acts which have been regarded as criminal since the time of Cain, and have been so written in every civilized code. There's a sense of natural law in this explanation, of some things being so base and self-evident that they needn't be spelled out for us to know them. It's an easy idea to understand, as Jackson said, regarded as criminal since the time of Cain. It is the innate gut reflex of morality that there are actions that cannot be allowed no matter the letter of the law. And yet, this was a fraught concept to introduce to a court in 1945. The Allies had, of course, killed many civilians over the course of World War II. The trials took place in a city still stinking from people buried under the rubble. Before the end of the year, Americans would drop the largest bombs ever created on urban centers. Moreover, many other crimes against humanity perpetrated by the members of the IMT were still within living memory, including British colonialism and the American racial hierarchy that had explicitly inspired Nazi eugenics. The solution to this problem within Nuremberg was blunt. The IMT decided the trials would not allow tu quoque or what about you defenses. The Nazis on trial would not be allowed to say, well, you did this too, as justification for their actions. It makes sense as a kind of legal necessity. Jackson pointed out that it implied, if some murderers go free, all must go free. But that particular defense, being barred from court, was also a tacit admission in the fallibility of the prosecuting countries. If said countries had recognized civilian torture, slavery, murder, and deportation as criminal since the time of Cain, why was it so easy to tu quoque them in the first place? I guess let's talk about who was in that first most notable trial. Or maybe we'll talk about who wasn't there. The award for the most notable missing guest would probably go to Adolf Hitler, who rinsed out his head with a bullet earlier in 1945. Also absent, head of the SS Himmler and chief propagandist Goebbels, who had followed their leader by offing themselves, and Holocaust architect Adolf Eichmann, who had temporarily escaped to Argentina. Finally, two of the men originally intended to be tried at Nuremberg, Leonardo Conti and Robert Ley, managed to kill themselves in jail before the trials. The problem of captured Nazis killing themselves was treated seriously. The IMT was determined to create a suicide-less jail. Every defendant was watched around the clock, guards in the jails instructed to literally never take their eyes off the prisoners. And yet, they failed in this task more than once. This failure prompts strange questions about the very notion of justice sought by the IMT. Wasn't the end result of this trial the execution of a bunch of Nazis? Is it such a failure that multiple of them skipped straight to the finale? Well, yes, because the trials were not summary executions, and the goal was not simply a dead Nazi. In an ideal world, the trials would end with true admissions of guilt. The prosecutor having perfectly proven the crimes of each defendant, the Nazis would be forced to face a mirror and recognize the monstrosity of their participation in the Reich. Suicide within a jail cell made that admission impossible. But if what you wanted was self-reflection by the Nazis, you weren't likely to find a lot of satisfaction in the trials anyway. 22 of those first slate of defendants lived long enough to make it to trial. Some were politicians or ministers, some were military leaders, and some were just prominent members of the party. It was an interesting batch. Their varied positions meant that multiple types of guilt were up for debate. Fritz Sauckel, for instance, who was in charge of deporting millions of civilians from German-occupied territories for forced labor, held a different kind of guilt than Julius Streicher, who didn't directly exert force over people, but instead published the blindingly anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, a vital tool in the Nazis' dehumanization of the Jews. Inevitably, the Nazis would argue that their particular position should exempt them from guilt and responsibility. Selkel would argue that he was merely providing workers, that he couldn't be responsible for the slave labor the civilians he deported were forced to do. Streicher would argue, he would argue that all the rancid propaganda he published was true, that it wasn't fair for his judges to be Jews, but also that he was powerless to Hitler's power of hypnotic suggestion. Hitler, in absentia, was blamed for virtually every decision made by every defendant. In 1946, Janet Flanner wrote for The New Yorker, quote, "Hitler's absence from the courtroom has been scarcely less troubling than his presence would have been. Absent, he has been, in a sense, both the murderer and the murdered. He has been the alibi and the corpse." Ultimately, the decision to bar two quoque defenses didn't seem to play a huge role in the trial, because almost none of the defendants were interested in actually defending the crimes against humanity of the Reich. They instead breathlessly described how they had no knowledge of the worst crimes, and or they were powerless to stop the crimes, and or they actually had tried to stop the crimes, and or they were good actually, and why were they on trial and not that other guy? This is not really an exaggeration. In After Nuremberg, Robert Hutchinson writes about Paul Blobel, a commander of a death squad that killed at least 60,000 people. Hutchinson summarizes his sniveling defense like this. So, in sum, Blobel was forced to serve in the East against his will, much to his anguish, but he never received any illegal orders or committed any illegal acts, and even if he did, which he could not have done either because of manpower limitations or his own ill health, he would have been completely justified in doing so because of the brutality of the enemy and the dangers to his family if he refused. Flanner, in contemporaneous reporting for the trials, wrote, "It is a fact that the 22 Nazis there helped put millions of people to death, quickly or slowly, by torture, murder, or starvation. But not one of them seemed to want to die for the thing they killed the millions for. Nobody said he would be proud to hang for his belief in the bloodthirsty ideology that cost the millions their lives. For the 12 years, and especially the last terrible 6, that these men in the box were in power, the world thought that they meant it. Then, as this trial went on, it became clear that they didn't mean anything, except their desire to fight for their skins." There were a few notable exceptions to this trend, what Hutchinson referred to as a psychosis of blamelessness. Hans Frank, a Nazi who served as the governor of occupied Poland during the war, admitted that he took part in the annihilation of the Jews. He said, "I myself have never installed an extermination camp for Jews or promoted the existence of such camp. But if Adolf Hitler personally has laid that dreadful responsibility on his people, then it is mine too. 1,000 years will pass, and still Germany's guilt will not have been erased." This is a moment when the actual trial matches my imagination of what it could be. An admission by a war criminal of not just guilt, but shame, a recognition of their complicity as a part of the whole monstrous machine. The dream of any trial, I would imagine, is not just that the judge or the jury holds a guilty defendant responsible, it's that the trial could actually cause the defendant to clearly see their guilt for the first time. Unfortunately, it's hard to say this is what happened with Hans Frank. In his final statement before the verdict, he absolved both himself and Germany of their burden. "I said 1,000 years would not suffice to erase the guilt brought upon our people because of Hitler's conduct in this war. Every possible guilt incurred by our nation has already been completely wiped out today, not only by the conduct of our wartime enemies towards our nation, but also by the tremendous mass crimes committed against Germans by Russians, Poles, and Czechs." Not even 4 months later, Frank decided Germany's 1,000 years of guilt had already been completely paid off. Probably the best performance at the trial came from Albert Speer, a Nazi architect promoted to Minister of War Production during World War II. Speer managed to walk a delicate line on the stand. He was deeply regretful of Germany's actions during the war and dismayed by Hitler's commands. At the same time, he claimed to be completely ignorant of the country's worst atrocities and had no knowledge of what was happening in the camps. Speer deflected his most damning charges with equally exciting stories. Did the court know he once tried to assassinate Hitler? In his final speech, Speer virtually ignored the fact that he was on trial at all and instead delivered a warning to modern civilization that Hitler's message spread because of the technological innovations of the radio and the telephone, that the next war, with chemical weapons and precisely targeted rockets, would end human civilization. Therefore, he hoped this trial could prevent such wars in the future and establish rules whereby human beings can live together. In Speer's speech, he didn't express regret, shame, or guilt. In fact, he positioned himself as more high-minded, the war having taught him sacred lessons that he was now disseminating to the court. And for Speer, it worked somewhat marvelously. He was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity, but his sentence was a relatively light imprisonment for 20 years. In Nuremberg and afterwards, he cultivated the idea of having been a good Nazi, one who only wanted the best for Germany. Martin Kitchen writes, Speer provided a thick coating of whitewash to millions of old Nazis. This was a man who was closer to Hitler than any other, yet who maintained his personal integrity as an apolitical technocrat. If a man so close to Hitler, with such immense power and with close connections to all the leading figures in the Third Reich, was unaware of the mass murder of the European Jews, how could the myriad of lesser figures possibly have known? In truth, Speer did not escape the gallows because of his wisdom and honesty learned through the horrors of war. He escaped because of a far more common Nazi trait: being a fucking liar. Speer, in his own letters, would reveal that he had literally been in the room when Heinrich Himmler announced the plan to exterminate all Jews. He had personally ordered the eviction of Jews from their homes in Berlin and profited hugely via the theft of stolen art and property. Albert Speer was photographed in front of the camps. He was smiling. Can you imagine a smile in front of a concentration camp, proud of the machinery, proud of the tracks, the structures, the slave labor he claimed to not know? They all claimed to not know as the ash filled their lungs and burned their eyes and buried their streets. They smiled in front of them, and they didn't know. They couldn't have known. We didn't know. We couldn't have. Albert Speer was not a well-meaning man put in a situation beyond his control. He was an aggressive participant in the worst of the Reich's crimes. His plot to assassinate Hitler was patently absurd, at best a half-tossed-out idea never acted upon, at worst, and more accurately, a total fabrication cooked up in his jail cell. Some proof of Speer's crimes emerged later, after his sentencing, even after his death in 1981. But much of it, his participation in the camps, for instance, was actually presented as evidence in Nuremberg. It's hard not to wonder if Speer's release from the gallows was because he presented his wartime experience as a proof of his value, his wisdom not compelling despite his closeness to Hitler, but because of it. Or maybe the prosecution was just doing a bad job. This was a consistent source of frustration, both internally and from outside observers. You'd think the prosecution had the easiest job in the world, demonstrating that Nazis carried out crimes against peace, war, and humanity. And yet, they struggled to be compelling. Part of this was due to American prosecutor Jackson's plan to call no witnesses and simply use the Nazis' own documentation against them. This was, intellectually, a compelling strategy. He planned to use this hard evidence to unequivocally prove the guilt of the defendants and reveal the scale of Germany's crimes. The documents he would use as evidence had no chance of courtroom perjury or poor performance under cross-examination, and they were written by the Nazis themselves. But in practice, reading documents doesn't make for an electrifying courtroom, and it gave the Nazis plenty of opportunities to quibble with specifics. Flanner wrote in 1945, "On the whole, our lawyers have succeeded in making the world's most completely planned and horribly melodramatic war dull and incoherent." There were dramatic moments on the stand when the defendants seemed to crumble under overwhelming evidence of their crimes. There were also moments, however, when the prosecution seemed to crumble. This was most evident in dealing with the main character of the first Nuremberg trials, if there was one, Hermann Göring. The Allies were proud to have nabbed Göring. He was basically the highest-level Nazi leader who hadn't already killed himself. Actually, Göring wasn't captured at all. He turned himself in, alongside many suitcases stuffed with stolen art, and one stuffed with over 20,000 paracodeine pills, of which he was taking more than 100 a day. And yet, Göring was also the sharpest, most dangerous defendant of the trial. Not dangerous in that he would physically attack anyone, but in that he was capable of exerting tremendous influence over the other imprisoned Nazis, coordinating strategy and coaching them on their narratives from within jail. The IMT was so fearful of this coordination that they attempted to completely isolate Göring, and yet even from within his cell, he made friends, with the men charged with watching him 24 hours a day, even with the jail physician. Within the court, seemingly everyone turned to Göring for his reaction to every event. Was he satisfied by another defendant's testimony? Was he shaken by the footage of the death camps? When Göring took the stand, he largely bowled over Jackson's cross-examination, using his time instead to narrate the epic course of his own life. Flanner wrote, "On the witness stand, he didn't wait to be asked questions by the Allied prosecution, he told them the German answers first. Göring made Machiavelli's prince look like a dull apologist. Göring was decidedly more amoral and funnier." He seemed to be better informed about Europe's history than the prosecutors, more agile in his defense than they were in their attack, more interested in eloquently telling his own personal epic than even really defending himself. Flanner concluded it was the complicated narrative of a brain without a conscience. Göring, unlike Speer or Stryker, had no doubt he would be executed. Before the trial even started, Göring said he would be willing to testify against many of the other defendants if he could buy himself execution via firing squad instead of the noose. In context of this certainty, his performance at the trial wasn't a plea for mercy, but a continuation of his own personal myth-making, an individual enactment of the fascist dream of an eternal empire. "We will be martyrs," Göring said. "Even if it takes 50 years, the German people will recognize us as heroes. They'll put our bones in marble caskets in a great national shrine." Of the 22 Nazis tried at the first Nuremberg trials, 10 of them were executed. 7 were given prison sentences, and 3 were fully acquitted. That leaves 2 men unaccounted for. Martin Bormann was tried in absentia and had, unbeknownst to the IMT, actually died earlier that year. The other unaccounted man was Hermann Göring. Göring was very much sentenced to death. Persico writes that it took more time to type the verdict than it did for the court to reach it. "There is nothing to be said in mitigation," his judgment read. His guilt is unique in its enormity. But on the day of the scheduled execution, mere hours before 11 men were set to be walked to the gallows, Göring bit into a cyanide capsule in his cell, convulsed, frothed at the mouth, and died. In his suicide note, Göring claims he possessed the pill the whole time. Others theorize he had outside help. In 2005, a 78-year-old former American guard unverifiably confessed to sneaking the pill into Göring's cell. In any case, the suicide was a final denial of the trial's legitimacy. He did not accept guilt, he did not accept shame, and he would not accept the judge's ruling. It is, depending on your perspective, the climax or anticlimax of the trial. Göring outwits the IMT at the last second. Göring sucks the air out of the trial's punchline. Which is kind of ridiculous, right? Because the end result is that he died a few hours earlier than he was supposed to. Göring faced trial, was judged guilty, and died the night he was sentenced to die. Reading about the remaining 10 executions, I personally experience a sort of deflation, a reminder of what I already knew, that there is no peace or virtue to be found in enacting a death sentence. The 10 Nazis were hung, one at a time, from a gallows built in the Nuremberg Gymnasium. It was done between the hours of 1:30 and 3 o'clock a.m. About 50 people in total were in attendance. There were no revelations that day, no necessary truths. Some went to their deaths quietly, some attempted honor. Wilhelm Keitel, the former chief of the Oberkommando, said he would follow all the German soldiers who had died for their fatherland. Streicher, the publisher of Der Stürmer, who claimed he had been under Hitler's hypnosis, apparently fell under the dead Führer's spell once again, screaming Heil Hitler and Purimfest 1946, before dying slowly at the end of the noose. Staff laid Göring's body next to the 10 other corpses. 3:05 a.m. on October 16th, 11 dead Nazis in a gymnasium. Justice served. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that it was nothing more than misfortune that made you a willing instrument in the organization of mass murder. There still remains the fact that you have carried out and therefore actively supported a policy of mass murder. For politics is not like the nursery. In politics, obedience and support are the same, and just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share the earth with you. This is the reason, and the only reason, you must hang. The bodies, along with their nooses, were cremated. The ashes were tossed into a river, the urns themselves were smashed. Göring's prediction would not come to pass, at least not literally. There are still no marble caskets, no national shrines, no bones to recover. There are, instead, the thoughts and opinions and memories of the survivors of the war. What do they think? What did Germany think? Reporting is mixed, to say the least. Obviously, a country's people are not a monolith. Flanner wrote that in her experience, the 1945 German public didn't particularly care about the trials one way or another. They were too shell-shocked from the war, too long flooded by misinformation to believe anything, too sick of hearing about the particular men on trial. She reports, they think the trial is an effort at propaganda rather than justice, a myth they have forgotten about and so no longer believe in. Persico writes that rich German families were eager to describe their mistreatment during the war and denounce the Reich. One never seemed to meet a Nazi in Germany these days, he notes dryly, except for the few in the dock at Nuremberg. Poles, themselves of course a fallible instrument, paint a slightly different picture, one of brief agreement with the actions of the Allies, followed by increasing frustration. In 1946, a reported 78% of the population thought of the trials as fair. By 1950, this had dropped 40 full points to a mere 38%. Perhaps more alarming, in 1947, more than half the population said they thought Nazism was, quote, a good idea badly carried out, a proportion that would increase in Germany over the next couple years. These narratives were encouraged by Nazi sympathizers in America, some of whom held prominent government positions. Joseph McCarthy, for instance, amplified the idea that these trials were an example of Jewish vengeance. His Senate colleague, William Langer, declared that the trials were a communist plot designed to seize the property of innocent German bankers and industrialists. And if this was the full arc of the Nuremberg trials, it would be a strange and naughty story of the beginnings of international justice. Some men hanged, some men imprisoned, some men freed, a world unsure of what to think. But the stranger story of the Nuremberg trials is that they didn't conclude the day of the hanging. Rather, the International Court disbanded, but the trials continued, both within Nuremberg and at Dachau, the concentration camp turned into a massive prosecutorial apparatus. Both of these were held by the US alone, rather than with the cooperation of other Allied countries. The following trials, held at Nuremberg, tried 185 Nazi leaders. The ones at Dachau tried 1,672 lower-ranking soldiers charged with war crimes. These trials originally handed out a total of 438 death sentences, 207 life sentences, and 868 shorter imprisonments. This is a much larger sentencing over a much larger swath of the Nazi Party, with generally much less attention paid by local or international press. But the real notability is what happened to those sentences. From 1946 to 1951, the U.S. military hanged 252 condemned prisoners at the same prison where the original Nuremberg executions were held. But not only were the remaining 186 death sentences commuted, by 1958, virtually every other convicted Nazi at the subsequent Nuremberg and Dachau trials, whether sentenced to death, life, or otherwise, walked free. Even of the 7 imprisoned after the original Nuremberg trials, only one, Rudolf Hess, served an actual life sentence in prison. It's hard to find a single reason that explains these commutations. Legally, the courts for these subsequent trials seemed to move away from Nuremberg's most famous determination. While the original trial may have ruled that just following orders didn't absolve anyone of responsibility, the subsequent trials and releases often seem to do just that. Hutchinson writes that this advisory board that determined clemency for German war criminals systematically questioned the parameters of individual guilt or responsibility as established by the tribunals. In other words, the courts decided that maybe it was a reasonable excuse that the Nazis were just following orders. But these legal determinations were also perhaps influenced by the larger political context of Germany in the 50s. Logistically, the US didn't want to be locked into the responsibility of monitoring the sentences of every Nazi imprisoned in Germany. Politically, the next war, the Cold War, was imminent, and the US may have been more interested in building a new allyship with Germany than maintaining the sentences of its war criminals. Ethically, the continued imprisonment of Nazis called into question the purpose of prisons writ large. That is to say, why exactly were the Nazis being held? Was it the risk of recidivism, that once released they would be a danger unto others? That seemed improbable. Their crimes, though performed as individuals, were done as part of a collective. No lone Nazi released free back into Germany was likely to try and rebuild the death camp. So why shouldn't they get out early for good behavior? Whatever the reasons that prompted the US to so dramatically reduce the sentences of these Nazis, the German public took the news as a referendum on the Nuremberg trials as a whole. The near-universal commutations suggested that something had gone fundamentally wrong at Nuremberg. It implied that the trials had, in fact, been the vengeance of a conquering country. This was reflected in German public opinion. By 1952, 60% disapproved of the handling of the trials by foreign powers, and only 9% of those surveyed believed that the still imprisoned Nazi generals were, in fact, guilty. The risk of recidivism is not the only reason to imprison war criminals. The more compelling rationale might be as a sort of message to the world. The continued imprisonment of Nazi war criminals could demonstrate that their crimes and crimes of a similar nature must be taken seriously. That there was no situation, not peace or war or economic ruin, that could justify mass deportations, enslavements, or genocide. It is hard to imagine that the way the trials did end, with a limp admission of the logistical difficulty of continuing consequences, sent that same message. While the international community was generally less fascinated by the subsequent trials the US held in Germany, they certainly reacted strongly to its shrug of an ending. All sides of the political spectrum in France, the UK, and the United States were incensed. They called it a complete reversal of a fundamental goal of the Allies. Newspapers said the commutations were a treason against the common good. One powerful criticism read, "A would-be war criminal of the future need not be discouraged by the Nuremberg trials from indulging in similar genocidal excesses." That retort came from, oh, interesting, the Israeli government. In 1960, 15 years after the first trials, Israeli agents would go to Argentina and find Adolf Eichmann, one of the Nazi leaders that evaded judgment at Nuremberg. The agents then abducted him. They captured him, snuck him through airport security, and put him on a plane to Israel. This was a very clear violation of several UN treaties. At first, Israel absurdly claimed that the abduction had been carried out by unaffiliated volunteers. Later, it admitted Mossad planned the whole operation with the knowledge and support of the Prime Minister. No matter the logistics, once Eichmann was in Israel, the plan was clear. He would stand trial, and he would, ultimately, hang. Eichmann protested in the same manner the Nazis had at Nuremberg, that he had not been a decision-maker, just a cog in the Nazi machine. He said he didn't have anything personally against the Jews, he didn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. It was this trial, in fact, that gave us the most indelible phrase of this whole saga of history, the banality of evil. It was coined by Holocaust survivor Hannah Arendt, who chronicled Eichmann's trial for The New Yorker. She wrote, "Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all." This banality did not preclude him from overseeing the murder of millions of people. In all likelihood, it enabled it. What did Israel hope to gain from the trial? Admission, guilt, shame? No, I doubt anyone thought they would wring these things from Eichmann. Arendt thought the desire was more base. "We refuse and consider as barbaric," she writes, "the propositions that a great crime offends nature so that the very earth cries out for vengeance, that evil violates a natural harmony which only retribution can restore. And yet I think it is undeniable that it was precisely on the ground of these long-forgotten propositions that Eichmann was brought to justice to begin with, and that they were, in fact, the supreme justification for the death penalty." This is the feeling that sits in the center of my chest, like a stone, like an anchor, as I watch intolerable cruelty around me and fantasize of Nuremberg. That the earth cries out for vengeance, that this cannot just happen and then we move on, that we cannot simply look forward as opposed to looking backward, that we cannot let this go unpunished and thus unacknowledged and thus forgotten. That there must be a consequence. An inchoate scream that echoes around my skull. God, I wish for you hell existed, but it does not. So there must be a consequence. I have this feeling now. I had it reading about Nuremberg. And then when I reached that climactic chapter, their sentence delivered, 10 genocidal necks snapped in a prison, I felt nothing at all. No relief, no less hollow, no natural harmony restored. The earth does not cry out for vengeance. The earth just cries. Did the trials deter anything? If punishment does not heal the soul, and it never, ever does, did the trials at least prevent more crimes against humanity? It is impossible to prove a negative. I can't point to the past 80 years for proof of what didn't happen. But the world did not stop its march of atrocities. I mean, the US alone. In 1990, Noam Chomsky said if the Nuremberg laws were applied, then every post-war American president would have been hanged. In 1990, he said that. In Germany, Nazism was largely made illegal, though it's hard to attribute this effort to the efficacy of the trials, especially given the note of resignation on which they ended. Nor can one look at Germany today and be proud of the lack of Nazism or its commitment to preventing genocide. Of course, the most irrational thing about yearning for a new Nuremberg is that a trial is necessarily reactive. It punishes a thing that has already happened. The damage has already occurred. If my concern is with humans and not some unmeasurable karmic sense of justice, Nuremberg represents a situation in which the worst possible thing is already a foregone conclusion. In 1945 and today, I'd trade the sentences of every responsible Nazi in return for one fewer civilian death, one family not forever shattered. It's this I try to remind myself of most of all. The point cannot be retribution. The point is to help each other survive. Hello. I've been working on the video you just watched for several months now. If you watched it on YouTube, congratulations! It is a weird feeling to work on something for so long while being quite confident it will be restricted in some way. I'm not sure if you had to be 18 to watch this, or maybe anyone can watch it but I can't make money from ads, or hey, maybe it's totally fine. No one knows for sure what the rules are, but I know that I will never weaken my writing by saying that Hermann Göring unalived himself. I can make these decisions because I have the support of you folks watching this, and also because of Nebula. And also, there's an extra video where I make a dessert. Let me explain. Nebula is a premium streaming service that provides a stable home for my work. A healthy chunk of your subscription to Nebula goes directly to me and funds my ability to make stuff like this. Even if this gets completely demonetized on YouTube, I am basically good because of Nebula. But it's also where I can put a ton of exclusive videos that don't really fit with the brand I've established here on YouTube, which is really important because, my God, I needed to make something that's not about Nuremberg. This has consumed my life for way too long. And that something turned out to be a strawberry trifle miso that I made with my fiance, and then we fed it to our friends. It's basically a big, silly cooking video, and you can see it right now, exclusively on Nebula. Anyway, if you want to support deadly serious videos like the one you just watched, and see them without ads and early and all that, Nebula is the place to go. And if you want to see me make hazelnut praline, Nebula is also the place to go. Isn't that wild? If you sign up with my link, you'll get 40% off an annual subscription, just $36 for a whole year. To be honest with you, I am going to keep making this kind of video no matter what. It's a kind of compulsion, I think. But it gets a whole lot easier with your support. Try it out with 40% off a subscription by going to nebula.tv/Jacob Geller.